V.C.Y. America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
Well, thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk. Ladies and gentlemen, do you feel all safe and secure now that the fiscal cliff has been averted? Or that's what we're led to believe, that we bypass going over the fiscal cliff. Do you feel all safe and secure now? Or are you like many who are just absolutely outraged over the dramatics and issues that took place here earlier this week? We're going to be talking about the fiscal cliff and the aftermath thereof. It's our privilege to have back with us today on Crosstalk Robert Romano, who is the senior editor with Americans for Limited Government. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, it's great to be on again. Thanks for having us.
Now, many have had their eyes just glued on the House and the Senate heading up to New Year's, wondering if we would go over what was called the fiscal cliff. And as the dust is now settling, more and more information is coming out. Frankly, a number of people are just outraged, and we're going to get into some specifics. But, Robert, if you would give us your overall reaction to what transpired earlier this week and leading up to this week.
Well, you're in wonderland right now, where up is down, down is up, and a tax increase is a tax cut. And particularly from Obama's perspective, where he wants to say, "Oh, I got your middle-class tax cut," in the same bill that the payroll tax holiday was being eliminated, and everyone's now going to be paying 2% more in their FICA taxes, and you'll see it come directly out of your paycheck just on the 14th or the 15th this month. And that's just one of the many things that's in there. There is another tax increase in there. Obviously, everyone making more than $400,000, individuals and couples filing at $450,000 are seeing their rates go up to about 40%. And that category includes many small businesses. So really this is just a recipe for higher unemployment. People are going to lose their jobs on account of those higher taxes. And this is Obama's so-called balanced approach, and this is what's necessary for deficit reduction, is for the most wealthy among us to pay a little bit more. But as a result, he got the rate he wanted for those $400,000 above. But according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, it's only going to produce about $30 billion of revenue in 2013, which is rather pathetic. That comes nowhere near paying for the $1.2 trillion deficit the government, or new debt that the government is planning on accumulating. And it will only pay for about 88 cents of every new dollar of interest that will be accumulated on top of that $1.2 trillion of new debt, as we go from $16.4 trillion to another $17 trillion. I'm going to go up by $1 trillion a year, even with this higher revenue. So the idea that this balanced approach is the way to balance the budget it's false and it's phony. And, yeah, we are in wonderland.
Who do you see as being the winners, and who do you see as being the losers in this?
Well, I shouldn't say that there's no good in this. I mean, there is permanent. The Bush era tax rates have finally been made permanent for everyone under $400,000. So I guess that's good news. We wanted to see permanent tax relief across the board, so we're obviously disappointed there. Democrats, they wanted to see everyone above $250,000, which was Obama's campaign promise, to have their taxes increased. So now that's off the table. So everyone's a little bit disappointed, but at the same time they got their tax increase, so they have something to hang their hats on too. So not everyone got what they wanted in this situation.
What would have been the consequence had Congress not acted on this? If the new Congress came into session, nothing had transpired, what would have been the consequence?
Everyone's taxes would have gone up. And that included the payroll tax, which I already mentioned, but that was allowed to expire anyways. But anyone who pays income tax would have seen their rates go up a few points as well.
So isn't it good then that we pass this?
Like I said, it's not all bad. The estate tax was relief with the exemption up to $5 million was also made permanent, and so again, there is some good on this, but the fact is the fact that they're out there trying to pretend that they're dealing with the national debt as a result of passing this fiscal cliff deal, or that there's not other bigger problems out there now, and that the economy is in clear waters right now, I think is illusory, and we've got major challenges ahead. Particularly the debt ceiling is coming due. And now all eyes are on the House of Representatives to see if they're going to make good on their promises to use the debt ceiling. In particular, John Boehner made a speech again this year saying he would use just a year that passed in 2012, saying he would use the debt ceiling to extract further spending cuts. Well, he's just narrowly won re-election to Speaker of the House, and it's on the promise of spending cuts. And to get this speakership back, he promised not to negotiate with Obama anymore. So we'll see if Republicans are finally ready to use their leverage in the House to get real spending cuts and entitlement reform, which they've been campaigning on, frankly, for over 20 years.
Oh, that's what I was going to say. Didn't we just hear those promises at the last time Mr. Boehner took that position?
Absolutely, and we didn't see it. They gave us the super committee, which produced nothing except, they did get sequestration because the super committee failed to do anything. But now, in the fiscal cliff deal, they canceled sequestration for 2 months.
Yeah.
And so now it's an open question whether they're just going to throw out sequestration altogether and say the heck with spending cuts and pretend like there's no problem, or even worse, eliminate the debt ceiling, which is what the Obama administration and Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner would like to do. Imagine if they didn't have the debt ceiling. Over $2 trillion of our budget, out of $3.6 trillion, is automatic spending, so-called mandatory spending or baseline budgeting. Which money that goes out automatically whether there's a vote in Congress or not. The only say members of Congress have on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera, this automatic spending, is via the debt ceiling. Because if you don't fund the debt ceiling, they're not going to be able to afford to pay those obligations. They'd be forced to engage in entitlement reform. Whereas if they eliminate the debt ceiling, you might as well just eliminate Congress because they're just a rubber stamp and they're never going to be able to rein in any of this stuff.
Robert, the president is seeming to blame the Congress for all the spending. He said, we will not have another debate with this Congress about whether or not they should pay the bills that they have already racked up. Keep referring to them as they. They've racked up these bills. They need to pay for them. This is spending or so-called stimulus that he has demanded. He's referring to the debt ceiling, that he wants this unlimited ceiling. What's your reaction to that, where the president is saying we're not going to have another debate? They need to pay the bills that they've already racked up.
He's not a dictator. That's my response. And Congress has the power of the purse. Congress, in Article 1, Section 8, has the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. And no appropriations are supposed to be made. No money drawn from the Treasury except for appropriations made by law. So it's not up to the president whether we have this debate or not. He's a spectator as far as that goes. It's up to Congress to decide whether or not we'll continue to borrow money or if we're borrowing too much money and maybe need to rein it in a little bit. And if he doesn't get what he wants there, it's not a matter of he has a say in this process. Yes, he has to sign whatever piece of legislation comes to his desk, but if Republicans in the House don't send him a debt ceiling increase, then he has nothing to sign. Mm-hmm. So his role in that is to either pass sign or veto any legislation that comes across his desk. And his role in pushing Congress around is quite limited in that regard. However, I would mention that according to a Treasury Inspector General's report about the debt ceiling debacle last time, the Treasury had no plan whatsoever to avoid default, and they view that they lacked statutory authority to make payments of principal and interest to our creditors first as a priority before all other payments. And as a result, that we would delay and therefore default on our obligations to our creditors, and that's his leverage. He's saying, if you try to use the debt ceiling, I'm going to default. And I think that's highly irresponsible. Frankly, we need to pass something that's been introduced in Congress called the Full Faith and Credit Act, which would prioritize all payments of principal and interest to our creditors first before any other payments are made, and that if the debt ceiling should be reached, because then they could just refinance debt up to the limit, and we could debate which spending we want to keep and which we need to get rid of. I mean, if Congress wants to assert their power of the purse, this is by far the most effective means of doing that. And since Obama's not interested in debating, he's not interested in negotiating, he's not interested in compromising. So Republicans have very little to lose. And frankly, they're starting to convince themselves that maybe they can't even get an electoral majority anymore. Well, they have a majority in the House right now, so probably, if they really believe that, they should probably take advantage of it right now and do the American people a favor and set us on a sustainable trajectory that will get us to a balanced budget and insist on entitlement reform.
You mentioned all this spending, and one of the things that is literally angering people across the country, we're ready to go over this cliff, and yet the pork that was rolled into this legislation, the fiscal cliff legislation, hundreds of millions of dollars in tax credits loaded into the final fiscal cliff bill. The deal, as it came to the House, was loaded with special tax credits for Washington's favorite industries and pet projects. Here's a few that were broken down from the Joint Committee on Taxation. $7 million credit for qualified plug-in electric drive motor vehicles to include electric motorcycles. $59 million for production of cellulosic biofuel with a maximum credit of $1 per gallon and inclusion of fuel from algae. $78 million for motorsports with the 7-year recovery period for certain motorsports racing track facilities. $119 million for tax credit for Indian employment. $154 million to credit for construction of energy-efficient new homes. $222 million for accelerated depreciation for business property on Indian reservations. Here, just a few more, $222 million to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands for a temporary increase in limit on the cover of rum excise tax revenues. $650 million for energy-efficient appliances and $248 million for special expensing rules for certain film and film and television productions, tax credits for Hollywood. This is outrageous.
Yeah, some of the things you're mentioning, Hollywood, NASCAR, this is ridiculous. This is the type of thing that makes taxpayers sick to their stomach when they think about all of the waste that goes on in Washington. And what do? They wait for a must-pass piece of legislation, insert all that stuff in there in the dead of night with no deliberation whatsoever and no means to amend it. It's like, take it or leave it. Otherwise, you're going to be responsible for raising taxes on every single American. They're doing the same thing with this Hurricane Sandy bill. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie is out there basically helping the president not to eliminate the spending problems that are in that bill that have absolutely nothing to do with hurricane relief. Just to add to the list of stuff you were tallying off there, you have $300 million bailout for Amtrak in the Hurricane Sandy bill, $150 million set aside for fishery disasters, including money earmarked for Alaska and Mississippi, which were not hit by Hurricane Sandy, and even $50 million for the National Park Service's Historic Preservation Fund. Give me a break. This is ridiculous. They take these bills that, ostensibly, you're not in favor of hurricane relief, so because they want to try to amend some of this stuff out of there. And I think that this is why we need a deliberative process. This is why we need an appropriations process, which is totally broken down. Congress hasn't engaged in that in years. All we're doing is governing by continuing resolution on the discretionary side of the equation. And then if you oppose that, you're trying to shut down the government. Or if you want to amend it, you're trying to shut down the government. Well, maybe we should shut down the government if this is how it's going to behave. And maybe the American people need to take a long, hard look at what's going on here and say, hey, wait a second, can we afford all this?
Robert Romano is our guest here today from Americans for Limited Government. We're talking about the fiscal cliff aftermath. And, folks, after the break, not only will we talk about the cliff here, but we've got some more so-called fiscal cliffs looming here in the not-too-distant future. You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY America Network.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, creation author and president of the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, during a pregnancy, how does the mother's body react to the unborn child inside of her?
Chris, believe it or not, the mother's body considers the growing fetus to be foreign material, and the immune system would normally get rid of it. But God has designed the mother's body so that during pregnancy a certain protein is found which decreases the risk of rejection. When this protein is found, the mother's body knows not to destroy the outside invader, in this case the unborn child. Chris, this is a marvelous gift from the Creator. Without this protein, the human line would cease in one generation. Thus, natural selection would have nothing to work on. This is another one of those chicken and egg examples. Which came first? Yes, indeed, our bodies are marvelously designed by a Creator who thought of it all. And He did it all back in Genesis.
For more on creation, visit our website at www.icr.org.
The aftermath of the fiscal cliff. We're talking today with Robert Romano, senior editor with Americans for Limited Government. Robert, just before we get more into this aspect here, give us a word about Americans for Limited Government.
Sure. We're a nonpartisan organization dedicated to, like it sounds, limiting government. We like to see a balanced budget, permanent tax relief, and far fewer regulations on doing business here in America. Which, frankly, it's way too expensive to do business here and to create jobs here. It's why you see over 23 million people unemployed, 5 million people who have given up looking for work altogether. Like 28 million people who cannot find full-time work in this economy, and we need to do something about that. And we could start by cutting taxes, cutting regulations, and strengthening the dollar.
Robert, there's another outrage. We talked about the pork that was in this legislation, but there's another outrage that so many have that's being reported that the U.S. Senate that voted 89-8 to approve this legislation had only 3 minutes to read the 154-page bill and see its budget score. Further, the House had previously made a pledge to allow 3 days for the public to read legislation before they voted on it. We understand that they had it approximately 22 hours, so much for their pledge. But give us your reaction to this. I mean, the Senate voting on this, just giving the stack of paper with 380 seconds to make their decision, basically.
Well, I guess it shows how deliberative the most deliberative body really is. They actually don't care what's in the pieces of legislation. They just care about political expediency and that there would be a firestorm politically and via the media should they not vote the way the mob says they need to vote with their propaganda pieces in the state-run media there. So hardly surprising, and it's not, and again, it's not surprising to see how cowardly they can be at times.
The president said he's not driven by an ideological agenda and that America can rest assured all he cares about is leaving behind an America that is stronger, more prosperous, more stable, and more secure than when he became president. Your comment?
False. Where to start there? I mean, we're not going to be more prosperous. We're more indebted than ever. We're spending more money on interest than ever. $400 billion a year going just to pay off our creditors. You're going to see you're $16 trillion right now. You'll be at $26 trillion. Consider this: in the past 30 years, the national debt has increased by over 1,300%. 30 years before that, it quadrupled. The 30 years before that, it went up 967%. If the next 30 years are anything like the past 90, you'll probably see the national debt anywhere from $50 to $100 trillion by 2042. That is Obama's legacy. We will not be more secure as a result. We will not even be able to afford to refinance the debt, let alone repay it, let alone maintain our military obligations and security obligations all over the world. This is going to be hugely, going forward, this sort of decline is going to be hugely destabilizing. Probably, lead to breakouts of violence, hyperinflation in areas. You're already seeing it. We've talked about it before. The Tunisia and Egypt going down was really as a result. It started out as food riots. And inflation there because we export all of our inflation overseas, particularly to oil-bearing nations that buy U.S. Treasury bonds and who have to have their oil priced in dollars because of the arrangement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to do so. That's why the dollar is the world's reserve currency. So I think no good is coming of this, and we're losing our position in the world as the world's greatest economic superpower.
We've got what CNN Money is calling 3 more fiscal cliffs. You kind of alluded to them. One is the debt ceiling. Mm-hmm. How soon is that going to be coming up as far as a vote on the debt ceiling?
Arbitrarily. Timmy Geithner right now is delaying payments to federal pension system and other payments to forestall hitting the debt ceiling. I've heard some estimates say that there will be new capital gains tax revenue in the fourth quarter because rates were going up at the end of the year. And sure enough, they did go up for the top investors in the country, for the most wealthy ones who had the most stock, obviously, to sell. And that Geithner he's saying to the end of February, but he may have till the end of April or May in terms of absolutely hitting the debt ceiling and not being able to borrow any more money, and therefore the functions of government ceasing, and by the Treasury's own admission, a default would ensue because they have no plan to avert it, even though they have ample revenue to pay principal and interest. And that's just one of the fiscal cliffs you mentioned. There's also there should be a continuing resolution coming due, I believe, in March. And what was the third one?
The third one is the sequester, putting us off, and that's the delay you talked about for 2 months. But we're going to face that one again.
Well, we need the sequester. It was the one bit of spending cuts that we've gotten out of this Congress, and now they want to roll that back too. Republicans and House members, anyone who cares about the future of this country and whether or not we're going to pass off a mountain of debt that cannot possibly be repaid to our children and grandchildren, need to take a stand on spending. It's not a matter of cancel and sequester. It's a matter of we need more of that. We need to totally change the baseline of our budget right now, which is on an unsustainable trajectory, and there's no reason to expect we're going to see the revenue, this so-called balanced approach, to come and meet it, because if you're growing the debt by 10% a year, you're not going to have the economy grow by 10% a year. You're not going to see revenues grow by 10% a year. So the debt to GDP ratio is going to continue to get out of control. And as that happens, it's going to require more and more borrowing. And that's going to mean that investors are going to need to invest more and more money in U.S. Treasuries, and that means less and less investment in the private sector and in creating jobs. I thought that everyone cared about jobs and creating jobs, and that was what the top issue in this past election was. Well, if they really cared about creating jobs, we'd spend a little bit less money on paying off banks and financial institutions here and overseas, and a little more money invested in our economy and producing things.
Within the last just couple of hours, the House, we referred to this, but they just reelected John Boehner as Speaker. We understand there were 9 defectors from the Republican Party who did not vote for him. We were told perhaps there might be a showdown taking place in the House, but they did put John Boehner back into this position. What does this say to the American people about this new Congress for the next 2-year term?
Well, for one thing, for the members of Congress who decided not to vote for John Boehner, voted for somebody else or abstained, which I think there was quite a few, more than 9. I mean, those were the overt ones, but there were folks who also hadn't voted, he needed an absolute majority. That's a warning shot across Boehner's bow that they're not happy with how the fiscal cliff talks were, and the tax deal there was dealt with, how the debt deal was dealt with in 2011, and how the continuing resolution deal was dealt with earlier in March of 2011. And that they expect much, much more to accomplish much, much more in this coming session. Because if this is supposed to be the Tea Party Congress, and they can't even get.
The Tea Party's outraged at this too.
Well, they should be. I mean, the one, the person who put Boehner over the top was Michelle Bachmann, the chairman of the Tea Party caucus in the House. It's rather remarkable from a political standpoint to watch that happen.
And Michelle Bachmann was very much against this fiscal cliff bill.
She was, and she has an exemplary voting record too. So it was actually quite shocking over here to actually see that she was the one that put him over the top, and it looked like Boehner was actually in real trouble there. If he didn't get to 218, even less than symbolically, I mean that he is considerably weakened as a result of this rebellion, nonetheless. And I think, the lesson should be this is a near political death experience for John Boehner. Hopefully he can come back to the principles that helped him to become Speaker in the first place and help Republicans sweep into the majority in 2010. And, he says he wants to use the debt ceiling to extract further spending cuts from the Obama administration. Well, I would suggest that that's definitely a good idea, and that the best way to achieve that is to be willing to hit the debt ceiling and dare Geithner to default. I don't think Obama administration makes it 2 weeks without financing for this government before they cave into whatever the House was demanding. And that gives them considerable leverage to say, we want entitlement reform right now. We want to balance the budget right now, or in 5 years, or in 10 years. Just get us on a sustainable trajectory, and the American people can start to have confidence in the dollar and in their government, that this process can be made to work on behalf of taxpayers instead of ripping them off again and again.
Do you find it interesting that while the Speaker supported the legislation, we had the House Majority Leader Eric Cantor and House Majority Whip Kevin McCarthy vote against it?
That was interesting, and it certainly fueled speculation that the Speaker's gavel was in question for Mr. Boehner. And then watching how members were voting on the floor today, turns out that story was true, and there was a movement to try to remove Boehner from office. So I think that the majority leader and anyone, I mean, there was 150 House Republicans.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at what happens on the state level to legislators that vote in favor of tax increases, typically they get targets painted on them for primary challenges. And in our own messaging, we were out there in each of the members' districts that are rejoining the 113th Congress, letting their local media know and letting their constituents know that, hey, they voted for a tax increase on small businesses, and this is going to result in higher unemployment. And yeah, they did. I mean, I can't think of a House or a Republican that hasn't pledged not to increase taxes. And the first opportunity where they have to take a stand on the issue and insist on permanent tax relief, tie it to the debt ceiling, and tie it to everything else that they're trying to accomplish, and actually achieve that, they vote for a tax increase. So, frankly, if they do get primary challenges, they'll have nobody to blame but themselves.
Conservative leader Brent Bozell said that the Republican Party loses its soul and co-owns the economic and political ramifications of the agreement. Do you agree?
I think so. I think that's accurate, at least for the ones who voted for it. And in particular, that comes down to leadership. I mean, most of the Democrats in the House voted for this. A minority of Republicans voted for it. But in the Senate voted nearly unanimously for it. So, I mean, both parties own this economy right now as far as tax rates are concerned. And for whatever boondoggles emerge as a result of the deal, which we'll find out about more of them, I'm sure, over the coming days, that will outrage people thinking this is what it takes to have a permanent tax rate. I mean, think of how long it took us to get there.
Our listeners who want to get more information on this, you got a website where they can stay informed on these issues?
Absolutely. You can visit Americans for Limited Government at getliberty.org. You can also check out our blog at netrightdaily.com.
Okay, that's getliberty.org and also netrightdaily.com. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. Folks, let's open our phone lines today. Our number 800-733-9829. That's 800-733-9829. We'd like to get your reaction to the vote that transpired here within the last couple of days pertaining to the fiscal cliff. Are you pleased with how things turned out? Are you concerned? What about your reaction to the pork? Did you know all this pork was in there? Did you know about the Hollywood credits that were given in there and breaks for the car racing and other aspects? Is that a good thing for America and our fiscal policy? Again, our number, 1-800-733-9829. We're going to take a quick 60-second break and come back to your phone calls here on Crosstalk as we speak with Robert Romano from Americans for Limited Government, and we'll take your questions then and comments as we come back from the break. Again, our number, 800-733-9829. You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America.
When it comes to the topic of music, often we are quick to provide a defense of the style of music that pleases us, without ever considering what God has said in His Word. Sadly, churches hoping to broaden their appeal are changing their music without regard to the principles laid down in Scripture. To assist individuals, pastors, and music leaders is the book Worship and Music in the Word. In this book, Dr. Dean Kurtz provides a comprehensive study of worship and music from Genesis to Revelation that guides the reader on this important issue. Over 350 pages of study, combined with practical, heartfelt applications from a pastor's heart, are offered, but always with an eye to the final authority, the inspired Word of God. VCY America is making available Worship and Music in the Word. 1 copy for a donation of $20 or 3 copies for a donation of $50. To obtain your copies, call 1-800-729-9829. That's toll free, 1-800-729-9829.
Robert Romano, our guest today, senior editor with Americans for Limited Government, and talking about the fiscal cliff aftermath here. And folks, there's so much that's involved in this legislation leading up to it, and there are many who feel betrayed as far as the tax increase. Robert is correct in saying this is the largest tax increase in American history?
Sounds like it's close to $500 billion over the next 10 years, and includes, we mentioned, $30 billion tax increase just this tax year alone on those making more than $400,000. Of course, it included the payroll tax holiday coming to an end. So there's about another $24 billion that folks will be paying extra this year. And when you raise taxes on everybody, it's hard for it not to be the biggest tax increase in American history.
Yeah. Well, let's get to the phone lines here from Chippewa Falls. Brad, you're on the air. Thanks for calling Crosstalk.
Hey, guys. I was just wondering, I thought that all the tax rates actually went up as of the stroke of midnight, so this was actually a tax cut, a real tax cut, because everybody's rates had went up at that point, even though it was only for several hours, and then they got the best deal that they could get with the president and the Senate.
Your thoughts on that, Robert?
Well, I mean, that's certainly what the politicians are saying in terms of, we didn't vote to increase taxes. We just failed to prevent taxes from increasing on those who were making more than $400,000. And and in fact, everyone's taxes still went up on January 1st. I mentioned the payroll tax. That didn't get cut. So, I mean, everyone's taxes went up, so it's hard to say that this was a tax cut when everyone's taxes go up.
One group pointed out that there was $1 in spending cut for every $41 in tax increase by this vote.
That's interesting. Since it increased the deficit and increased spending, I'm not sure what the spending cuts were.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brad.
Thank you, guys.
Hamilton calling from New York. You're on the air.
Yes, hi. My question is, we've been hearing lately that Congress is getting these bills put in front of them and only given a few minutes to read through them.
Yeah,
and it's almost beginning to be a trend in Congress, especially with the presidents, just making them do it and they have to vote on it. People keep paying taxes, and I'm wondering, is it even worth voting anymore, or anybody doing their taxes at the end of the year? Because it seems like if our voices are not being heard, we need to take a different approach about this. And I'm wondering if that's one of the best ways to do it. I mean, we have to stop the bleeding, and they're not listening to the people, and they're not giving Congress time to really do what they need to do for the people, what's going on.
Yeah, and this is, and we'll have you comment, Robert, but this is why there are many who are, and I believe Tea Party has said, we will run candidates in primaries to challenge those who voted in favor of this.
Well, maybe that's what needs to happen in terms of folks questioning why they vote anymore. I question why we even pay taxes anymore. I mean, if they can just borrow and print all this money, and then they're going to say we're going to have a balanced approach that raises close to no revenue to actually rein in the debt, well, gee, maybe they can just borrow and print it all and spare us all the all the heartache of watching 40% of our paychecks go to a government that couldn't lead its way out of an empty room.
Interesting concept. Yeah, just print more money to pay everyone's taxes. Thank you, Hamilton, for raising the issue. Sheila in Ohio, you're on the air.
Yes, I just was wanting to say what the first person said, that everyone got a tax increase, not just the wealthy, and that's not being portrayed over the news anywhere. It's just, they're just saying it was that Obama got what he wanted by taxing the rich, and he even came on and said that, So, but as far as what that last fella said about voting, the Bible tells us we're to be responsible for the government. We're supposed to pay Caesar and pay God. So that's kind of the answer to that gentleman's question.
You're right, Sheila. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. A very interesting aspect to all of this here, and certainly the fallout. There's going to be much ramification that happens as a result of this. But what does this do to the confidence of the American people, Robert?
In terms of their government?
Yes.
I think this is all very deeply troubling. I mean, ever since, frankly, 2008, when you started seeing the TARP bailouts, and they're voting for that, and then, this must pass stimulus, and then, you have to do Obamacare, and then down the line. Then they do the Dodd-Frank so-called financial reform that institutionalized bailouts and made them permanent under the guise of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which will oversee these now without any vote in Congress. I think that the American people are feeling beleaguered that there appears to be no means of reining in this big government monstrosity that's on the loose right now, and it gets whatever it wants, and there's no opposition whatsoever that can be mounted effectively.
And you mentioned Obamacare. I mean, this year people are starting to pay even additional taxes for the implementation of Obamacare.
Yep, and that's just going to get worse as time goes on. I mean, especially once the Medicaid increases come into full view, and the burden that's being levied upon the states to implement Medicaid expansion. Hopefully, more states opt out of Medicaid expansion because, frankly, it's eating up much of or most of their budgets right now. And it's just going to become more and more problematic because, as a matter of law, we've told everyone that they have to have health care, and if you can't afford it, the government has to provide it, which means taxpayers have to provide it, which means they're going to be looking for more taxes.
Mitchell, South Dakota. Brian, you're on the air.
Yes, you mentioned that part of this bill is tax credits or credits to Hollywood. What is that? What is that credit to Hollywood?
Okay, it's not really a tax cut. It's a subsidy, and that's just the money that we are taking from other taxpayers. We're borrowing it, we're printing it, and we're giving it to favored industries such as Hollywood. We mentioned NASCAR and a few others. That it's just absurd that these special interests, these corporate interests, have their claws on the public treasury, and they get whatever they want out of these pieces of legislation, and it's disgusting, frankly.
Okay, so what is the reasoning behind Hollywood needing tax money? Where does that reasoning come from?
I don't know. I'm sure there's a quid pro quo in there somewhere. I imagine they gave healthy campaign donations to whoever supported putting that provision into the bill.
Oh, okay, interesting. Hey, is abortion, or not abortion, is Planned Parenthood part of this bill too? Are they being funded by this bill too?
I honestly can't comment intelligently on that. I didn't see it mentioned anywhere, so I just don't know.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your call. Let's see. I think Tony Perkins had pointed out that the Democrats' belated Christmas present in this tax bill included not just Democrats, and there are many Republicans who voted for it, included $430 million in tax perks for Hollywood. And I think that's, I don't know for certain, but I believe it has to do with tax breaks for shooting their films and so on here in the United States. Okay, to Navarre, Florida. Rick, you're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to reinforce a point that was made earlier that the leadership in the House voted against the Cliff bill that was passed, incidentally, at almost 11 p.m. On Tuesday. They avoided the 11th hour by 3 minutes, incidentally. But I wanted to make the point that all of the leadership voted against it, except Boehner. Not only did Cantor and McCarthy vote against it, but also Conference Chairman Hensarling and also Committee Chairman or Policy Committee Chairman Tom Price voted against it. So it was unanimous, except for Boehner, that it was not a bill that should be supported. And one more thing, I'd like to contest the point that the Republican Party has sold its soul by agreeing to this Cliff bill, taxing the rich and so forth. What's happened is that the rhinos who run the Republican Party have sold the party down the river. That's what's happened. The rank and file of the party is opposed to this bill, and the Tea Party is an up-and-coming manifestation of the power of the rank and file, and the rhinos are going to be on their way out. And we know who they are now. The 85 rhinos who voted for this thing at almost 11 p.m. on Tuesday are going to be in real trouble come primary and election time.
Thank you, Rick, for your thoughts. And we'll have you comment on that, Robert. But let me ask you, too, I believe Congressman Paul Ryan, former VP candidate with Mitt Romney, voted in favor of it, too. Is that right? That
is absolutely correct. And so did the new conference chair of the House Republican Conference, Kathy McMorris-Rogers.
And yet campaigned against the very things that they voted for.
It's funny how that works out when the rubber meets the road. I guess you find out who's really standing with you, and you find, maybe they really believed. You give them the benefit of that. This was the best deal they could get. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to see taxes go up on everyone, so they, throw the small businesses under the bus. They're not that important. It's only employ most Americans.
Did they feel that perhaps they had no other option at that 11th hour?
I think so. To be frankly honest, it's a tough vote when push comes to shove, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't have been fighting all along. They've had 2 years to deal with this, and they wait to the 11th hour, and then they're surprised they can't get a better deal. The leadership and those who went along with it. When, frankly, there were several opportunities along the way, several leverage points, whether it be the continuing resolution that came due in September, that could have been, they could have dealt with the tax issue right then and there. And it always boils down to the fact that the House, under this leadership, is unwilling to allow for any either a partial or full government shutdown when Obama proves unwilling or unable to compromise or negotiate or to offer any concessions. And frankly, I think that's very disturbing because what's going to happen is that Obama's just going to continue to roll House Republicans until they stand up and say no more. And so I guess we're going to find out real soon when this debt ceiling comes due and when the next CR comes due and see if they cancel sequestration or not. That might be your best indicator is what they do on sequester. If they're just going to cancel sequester without any offsetting spending cuts, I think, I have very low hopes for what this Congress might achieve going forward.
Yeah, and it seems we're not too far away from October 1st when the next budget is due as well.
It just round and round we go.
Yeah.
The appropriations process is broken. Meanwhile, the government's operating on autopilot, and that spending, that so-called mandatory automatic baseline budgeting spending, is going to go from $2 trillion this year up to more than $4 trillion by the 2022. And so we shouldn't be surprised that government and Congress is unable to achieve anything when, frankly, they can't even vote on 60% of the budget. There was no vote on the Social Security budget last year or the year before that or any year before that, or Medicare budget or any of that. All those big-ticket items, the true drivers of our debt, have been abdicated from Congress. The power of the purse constitutionally is being watered down to near meaninglessness. And if they could do it, like I mentioned earlier, if they do away with the debt ceiling, there's going to be no means whatsoever to rein in big government and the spending that's going on.
Let's go to Deborah in Wisconsin. You're on the air. Hello, Deborah.
Hello. My point was President Obama, one of his campaign promises was he said he was going to cut the national debt in half, and then after 4 years he said, well, that wasn't enough time. I need 4 more years. So, a lot of people, and then I was wondering if Bank of America and all these other places can come out with a credit card, would it be possible at any time for the government to come out with like a 10% interest credit card to like a national credit card to pay for health care, for example, but I don't see how our national debt is ever going to go down, which was one of President Obama's promises the first 4 years.
Okay, we're going to take a break. We'll come back and address that, Deborah. Thank you for the call. 800-733-9829 is our number. What do you think? A national credit card? We'll have our guest comment on that. That would really put the government into the banking business. We'll be right back.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website is worldviewweekend.com. I believe one reason why God has allowed the re-election of President Barack Obama is because many self-professing Christians, many evangelical leaders, many new religious right leaders, as I call them, have violated God's word in this specific area, They have united in one spiritual enterprise after another with unbelievers, in direct violation of 2 John 9 through 11, Romans 16:17, 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 17. In fact, Jerry Falwell Jr. said to Glenn Beck in August of 2010 on his radio show, quote, "If we don't hang together, we'll hang separately." I mean, that's what my father believed when he formed the Moral Majority, an organization of Mormons, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, people of no faith. And there are bigger issues now. We can argue about theology later after we save the country, end quote. No, we cannot argue about theology later. Theology is your view of God. That's the only thing that will save a people, is preaching biblical theology.
This is Crosstalk on VCY America, as we're speaking with Robert Romano from the Americans for Limited Government website, getliberty.org, and netrightdaily.com for more information on these issues. Robert's a senior editor with Americans for Limited Government. What about this call that we had just before the break? Wasn't there a promise that the deficit was going to be reduced in half? And then also, what about a national credit card?
Sure. Okay, two things. On the deficit, Obama has clearly broken his promise. He promised to cut the deficit in half. Instead, we're still running well over $1 trillion deficits year on end, and the national debt will accumulate by over $1 trillion every year for the next decade until, as I mentioned, 30 years from now, it could be anywhere from $50 to $100 trillion. I don't think we could repay it, let alone refinance it, and we're going to have major problems at that stage for our children and grandchildren. It's not exactly the legacy we want to be leaving to them. As for a national credit card, where the idea where the government would be issuing for consumer credit purposes, and then I suppose the interest that's paid back would go to paying down the national debt. We already have a national credit card. It's called the Federal Reserve. And it couldn't possibly be lending more money, particularly to financial institutions right now. And the interest it earns on U.S. Treasury and other obligations already gets paid back to the Treasury. So it would just be more of that. But I'm not sure that's a good idea. When it seems that whenever the government issues loans that go bad, that they just want to try to find a way to forgive them anyway. So what you'd end up just adding more and more money to the debt anyways.
Mm-hmm.
We're probably better off with financial institutions privately issuing credit.
I couldn't imagine all the defaults that would go on.
Yeah, I mean, it's already a huge problem. That's why, you have a $54 trillion of credit outstanding nationwide. You only have a $15 trillion economy. You only have less money than that's even in circulation. It appears to me that they're creating credit out of thin air, and that we are way over leveraged as a society as a result. And that's probably the thing to rein in. We don't need more credit to rein in the debt. We need a whole lot less credit, and the ability for these private entities to create money when it's supposed to be Congress who has the power to coin money under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution should be deeply troubling for those who care about the value of their savings.
Let's go to Bayview. Mike, you're on the air.
Yeah, I especially like the part when Obama said that he was going to raise on the rich people, he was going to tax them more. But all the Republicans said, no, it's not going to happen. We're not going to let it happen. And then all of a sudden, Obama did get his way, and it did happen. And he just snickered and grinned through the whole thing. This just makes me sick, and I have no confidence at all. We've definitely got to get somebody else in there that can run this country, because he's running it right into the ground, just as he was. Just as his plan was to do, and that's what he's doing.
Thank you, Mike, for your comments here. To another call from Wisconsin. Go ahead, caller. You're on the air.
Yes, I had been at a meeting years and years ago, and it's something I have never heard since, and I've never heard it talked about, and I'm hoping and praying that there's some people out there that maybe could give us some information on this. At this meeting, we were told that anyone who goes to Washington, D.C. and gets a job, there's an indoctrination of about 2 weeks of the do's and the don'ts. And to me, you just kind of wonder, what has gone on, because our guys, who are some decent guys, they go into Washington and they really are wanting to do good, but it seems, they get wimpy or something, and you just wonder if their lives are being threatened or what.
Thank you.
Good thing we're based out of Fairfax, Virginia, and not Washington.
Yeah.
I got my first job with ALG after college, and I came straight here. So thank God I missed out on being corrupted by the working in Washington. But frankly, that is a huge problem.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's indoctrination per se, but there's certainly incentives for those who enter D.C. to not to do what they say, and certainly elected officials have proven that again and again, that they'll say one thing to their constituents and do something entirely different when they get into office.
Look what's happened to the likes of Congressman Tim Huelskamp, who stood up and not toting the party line on this, saying no, we need to reduce here, we need to do this or that, but he stripped from committee assignments then at that point. So there's consequence to those who will stand up to their own party in that regard.
Absolutely,
so.
Yeah, and that's nothing new in terms of how folks maintain leadership. Huelskamp just came out today. You can see the story up on Politico saying that if you knew what Boehner had to do in order to maintain the speaker's chair today, you'd be sick. And that's in terms of dangling committee assignments and chairmanships, I guess, to some to members who were thinking about voting against him, and then just buying off the votes one by one. I mean, that's pretty typical. I mean, that's just how things are done in Washington, D.C. That's politics. And sadly, it's the least bad form of government.
We're going to squeeze one last call in from Meridian, Mississippi. Gary, you're on the air.
Yes, I wanted to know if the House got a pay increase. I'm going to let y'all answer that.
Thank you, and I did see it. Thank you for this call. I did see a story just the other day that that the House, Senate, including leadership, did get a pay increase. Robert,
I'm seeing it here up on Fox News. Certainly, that lawmakers are trying to actually introduce legislation that will rescind Obama's pay increase. I haven't seen the details, though. Any word on how much the increase was?
I believe it was, and I don't have my notes in front of me, but I believe it was about a 0.5% pay increase, somewhere about there, 0.5% to 1% in that vicinity. But I don't have those numbers available to me right now.
Well, I'm sure it's reassuring to the American people when they're busy losing their jobs and struggling to find jobs that at least Congress got their COLA. And Frank, what could be more outrageous as we're racking up mountains and mountains of debt, and they're saying we all need to pay more in taxes. They just passed the largest tax increase in American history. Now we know why. They wanted to get paid more.
Robert, we're down to about 30 seconds. Sum up some of your thoughts on the issue today and how our listeners can stay engaged.
Well, clearly the American people need to keep engaged, because if they do not, the deals that are coming forward are not going to be any better than the deals that have already come by. And by staying in the process and, take a look at those primaries, see if there are other candidates, regardless of what political party you're in. The people we vote for are the ones who have to make these decisions, and who you vote for may be the most important.
Elections have consequences.
They sure do.
Robert Romano from Americans for Limited Government, thank you for being with us today.
Have a good day.
And folks, the website, getliberty.org. Also check out netrightdaily.com. Thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk.
Listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.